So in this video, let's look at the various macro-environmental factors that affects a firm's ability to serve its customers. And as I mentioned in the previous video, the best way to remember the names of these macro-environmental factors is by using the acronym called as CD STEP. So let's look at the first macro-environmental factor, which is called as culture. So if you have to define culture, think about it. How would you define a culture? Culture is nothing but it is the shared belief, moral, customs and values of a particular group of people. It is what a particular group of people believe to be true. Culture is something that an individual is not born with. Over a period of time, people acquire a particular culture. And there are some aspects of culture which is easily observed, and there are other aspects of culture which are very difficult to even observe. Some of the easily observable attributes of a culture would be a particular country's language, right? The kind of dress that people wear in that culture, the kind of food that people eat in that particular culture, their taste. These are some of the attributes in a culture that can easily be observed. On the other hand, there are some attributes which are more subtle ones and are very tough to identify. These are called as the non-verbal cultural attributes. Examples of these could be the etiquette, how you behave in front of a group of people. Another example could be how different cultures value time. In some culture, time is everything, whereas in other culture, typically in the Asian culture, it is relationship that is everything. I'll give you an example as to how these subtle differences could really make a big difference in a firm's marketing strategies. For example, when Pepsi was first introduced in India, what they did was they showed an advertisement where a group of family members are sitting together and enjoying their lunch. And on the dining table, they had their food and they also had a can of Pepsi next to their food. However, this ad was not very successful in the Indian community. The reason being is during those times, and even today, in India, when somebody is eating lunch, it is not a tradition or it is not in the culture to consume carbonated beverages along with your lunch. Pepsi, after conducting an extreme marketing research, understood this fact and they immediately changed their advertisement. So in the next set of advertisement, they show that guests are coming into a person's house and the host in that house is serving the guest with Pepsi beverages. And this is very common in the Indian culture, where beverages like Pepsi and Coke are usually kept in the fridge and are served to the guest, but are usually not served to the family members when you are having your lunch together. So these subtle differences in the country culture is very important to be understood by the organization. And it is not only important to understand the country culture, but also it is important to understand the regional culture. Because different regions in one particular country also has a very different culture. For example, if you think about the soda that we drink, Pepsi and Coke. Some parts of the country in the United States, 41% of the people, they call it as Coke. Especially if you go towards Atlanta. In some other part of the country, people would call it as pop, while in other part of the country, people would call it as soda. And if you visit Texas, Dr. Pepper is the generic name for any carbonated beverage that you drink, because Dr. Pepper originated in Texas. Therefore, it is very important for an organization to understand the country culture as well as the regional culture in that particular country. Next, let's look into the second and macro environmental factor, which is called as demographics. If I ask you what are the typical demographic variables, your answer would be that the typical demographic variable are your age, gender, income, and education. And this demographic segmentation is probably the most common form of segmentation because the information is so widely available. It is so easy to collect information on your consumers' demographics. It is so easy to collect their age, their gender, their income, and education. So let's look at the first demographic variable, which is age. So here, with respect to the age, you can divide your consumers into various generation cohorts. Consumers who were born between the age of 1946 and 1964 are called as baby boomers. Consumers who were born between the age of 1965 and 1976 are called as Generation X consumers. And then you have Generation Y consumers who were born between the age of 1977 and 2000. These consumers are also called as millennials. And then you have Generation Z consumers who were born between the age of 2000 and above. These are also called as digital natives because these were the group of people who were born in a world full of electronic gadgets and digital technology which is already available to them. Then you have Generation Y consumers who are also called as the millennials. And right now there are more than 60 million people in the United States who were born between the years of 1977 and 2000. And if you see the baby boomers who are between the age of 50 and 68 right now, they are those consumers who have the maximum amount of disposable income left to be spent on the various products and services. And hence you'll see a lot of firms these days who are targeting specifically to baby boomers because the firms know that baby boomers have the money to spend on their products. If you see various yogurt companies, they are coming up with ads stating that their yogurt has extra calcium which is required for the aging bones. If you look at Amazon, they also have a particular website which is only for baby boomers. Hence, baby boomers are the center of most of these marketing strategies today. Apart from age, other demographic variable that makes a difference in your consumer's buying behavior is a person's income. Over here in the advertisement, you see a toy made by a specialty retailer called as HS versus you would also find toys available at any Walmart toy section. This toy over here is targeted towards high income community, and then you have other toys available in standard toy shop which is targeted to more middle class consumers. Another example is the kind of jeans that Levi's manufactures. They have three different brands. They have Levi's Strauss, Levi's Signature, and the Levi's Warhol collection, each selling at different stores at a different price. You will find Levi's Strauss mostly in Walmarts, Levi's Signature in shops like Kohl's, JCPenney, Macy's, and then you'll find Levi's Warhol collection which is sold in shops like Nordstrom. The third demographic factor which affects your consumers' purchase behavior is called as education. Somehow education is related to income, and together education and income would determine a person's spending power. If you are well educated, probably your needs and wants would be much different from a customer who is not very well educated, right? So education also would define what kind of products a customer would buy. The third demographic variable that would affect a consumer's decision-making process is called as gender. If you look in the United States today, you'll see that the roles of males and females have been shifting, and marketers are taking advantage of this shifting roles. If you see a Samsung ad these days, you will find an ad where the mother is doing the grocery shopping and the father is staying at home and using the Samsung phone to change the kid's diaper. So the father is taking instruction from the mother as to how to change the kid's diaper. Therefore, the focus of gender has changed drastically, and this change in the gender focus is well seen in today's advertisement. So the last demographic factor that affects a firm is the customer's ethnicity. If you look at United States today, you'll find the culture of United States to be more heterogeneous. If you look at ethnicity, it has been said by 2050 the minorities in the United States will represent 50% of the population. So who are the three major minority groups in the United States? You have the Asian consumers, you have the African consumers, and you have the Hispanic consumers. And each of these consumers have a very different approach towards shopping. For example, if you talk about Hispanic consumers, these consumers, they make shopping as a family affair. They go out together when they have to shop for a particular product. If you talk about African consumers, they are those consumers who believe in buying more classic products. And if you talk about Asian consumers, these are those consumers who want to save money and they are very interested in the various investment opportunities that a firm has to offer to these different consumers. So if you look at most of these bank advertisement, investment firm advertisements, they are more targeted towards the Asian ethnic consumers. Second, let's look at the third macro environmental factor, which is called as social factor. A lot of social trends today is shaping various consumer values in the United States and in the entire world. There are consumers who give a great emphasis on the health and wellness concerns. At the same time, there are consumers who are very environmental conscious, and these are called as greener consumers. In fact, if you look at the statistics, you'll get to know that in the past 20 years, child obesity has doubled and teenage obesity has tripled in the United States. And this has been a great concern for most of the consumers. So what are various firms doing for these kind of consumers, for the consumers who are concerned about their health and wellness? Retailers like Safeway, Wegmans have added dietitians at their stores. So you can consult a dietitian inside the store, and these dietitians will help you to find out products which would benefit your health. And due to this changing trend of health and wellness concern, you'll find consumers spending a whole lot on yoga classes, yoga mats, and increasing gym memberships. And then another social trend is called as the greener consumer. These are those consumers who believe in more environmental friendly products. And firms today are making efforts to supply their customers with environmental friendly and sustainable merchandise and services. And for these greener consumers, marketers, they are encouraging consumers to replace their washing machine with new energy saving machine and detergent which are more phosphate free. Another example is Frito-Lay's, which uses solar power at one of their factories to harness the sun's energy to produce its products. So firms these days are taking extra effort to supply their consumers with more environmentally friendly products. There's another term here that you need to remember, which is called as greenwashing. These are those consumers who question the firm's ability to produce more greener products. They are skeptical whether the firms are really interested in improving the environment, or they are just marketing their products or services as environmentally friendly with the goal of just making higher sales, or these are those firms who are actually doing something for the environment. So greenwashing is a term used by more skeptical consumers who doubt if a firm are actually doing something for the good of environment, or they are using marketing strategies with the goal of just gaining public approval. The fourth macro environmental factor that affects a firm's ability to serve its consumer is called as technology. If you look at technology today, it has impacted every aspect of marketing, whether it be coming up with a new product, coming up with new form of communication, or coming up with new retail channels. Some development in technology that has really affected the retail environment is the introduction of RFID, which is the term for radio frequency identification device, which helps a firm to track an item from the moment it was manufactured through the various distribution system, the time it enters the retail store, and the moment it reaches to the hands of the final consumer. With the help of RFID, the manufacturer exactly gets an idea as to how many products were manufactured and how many products are available in the retail store to be sold. And accordingly, they can decide as to how many more units they need to manufacture in the next coming weeks. The fifth macro environmental factor that affects the firm is the economic factor. And the various economic factor that affects a firm is the inflation in a particular country. And inflation is nothing but it is the increase in the prices of goods and services. If inflation is too high, what happens? Your purchasing power reduces. You'll start buying less expensive version of that particular product or services. Therefore, inflation in a country would definitely affect as to what kind of goods and services will be sold in that particular country. Another economic factor is your interest rate. Interest rate will represent the cost of borrowing money. If interest rates are low, you will borrow more money, right? You'll buy houses, you'll invest your money. And if interest rates are high, what you do, you save money in the bank so that you can earn the interest. Another factor that affects the economic situation is the foreign currency fluctuation. An example of this would be how much is $1 worth in Europe? How much can you buy with $1 in a different country? And when a dollar is worth more than the euro, American made products become more costly for the European consumers. But the US buyers can get great deals in the European countries. So foreign currency fluctuation also affect your firm's ability to serve its customers. And finally, you have the political and the legal environment. The various political and regulatory environment comprises of the various political parties, government organization, and legislations and laws. And organizations must fully understand and comply with these different legislations. Let's look at the four very important legislations in the history of United States. Even though these legislations were enacted in the early 20th century, some of these laws still remain the backbone of the United States legislations. The first one is called as the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, Sherman Antitrust Act, it prohibits monopolies and other activities that restrain trade and competition. According to this particular legislation, different competitors cannot collude their prices. In other words, according to this particular legislation, two different companies, they cannot engage in a horizontal price fixing scenario. They cannot fix the price for the customers. Then you have the Clayton Act, which was introduced in 1914. Now, Clayton Act was kind of a supplement to the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was an extension of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this act was primarily concerned with market strategies, commercial pricing ethics, and the protection of the citizen of the United States from the various exploitative measures undertaken by the different measures. Example could be that the Clayton Act would prohibit combination of two or more competing firms through pooling ownership of stocks and restricting pricing policies such as price discrimination. So before two firms plan to merge with one another, they need to take the permission of the government and prove to the government that they are not merging to exploit the various consumers. The third one is called as the Federal Trade Commission, which was again introduced in 1914. And this legislation was created to regulate unfair competitive practices and practices that would deceive or are unfair to the various consumers. And then finally, you have the 1936 Robinson-Patman Act, which regulates price discrimination towards the retailers and the wholesalers. So this act was introduced to regulate the unfair competitive practices towards the various retailers and the wholesalers. So this brings us to the end of this particular chapter. So let's quickly check whatever we have learned in this particular video. So the first one is, what are the 6 key macro environmental factors? Remember, the 6 key macro environmental factors are your CD step. You have culture, demographics, social issues, technological advances, economic situation, and the various political and regulatory environment. Second, differentiate between country culture and regional culture. Country culture is the entire culture, but the regional culture is based on the region or area within that particular country. Third, identify the different generation cohorts. We spoke about 4 different generation cohorts. They were the baby boomers, then you had Generation X consumers, you had Generation Y consumers, who are also called as the millennials, and then finally you have the Generation Z consumers, who are also called as the digital native consumers. Finally, what are some important social trends which are shaping consumer values and shopping behavior? We spoke about 2 different social trends. The first social trend was the health and wellness concern, and the second one was greener consumers. So this brings us to the end of this particular chapter. So in this chapter mainly we looked into the 2 different factors that affect the firm's ability to service customers. The first one were called as the immediate environmental factors, where you had the company itself, the competition, and the various corporate partners. And then after that you had the macro environmental factors, which affects the firm's ability to serve its customers.